All right, grade 10s, welcome back to WCHS. Yesterday we got started with the second and last unit of the year. The unit is Contemporary Globalization. Today we're going to continue with that. We have a little bit of tidying up with Chapter 9 to do, and then we're going to jump into Chapter 10 today. Yesterday with Chapter 9 we looked at how we saw a paradigm shift in the first half of the 20th century, a shift away from zero-sum competition and towards global cooperation. A shift that was deemed necessary because of the cost of World War I, the fear of communism and fascism, and the cost of World War II. When we say cost, we mean financial, but we also mean psychological and a cost to the lives of individuals. All right. We also looked at the Imf and World Bank, and we did some work to see what they have in common and what they have different. In terms of the World Bank and the IMF, we understand that they both came out of the Bretton Woods Conference from 1944, and it was at Bretton Woods that the foundation for contemporary globalization was laid. And they met in 1944, even at the height of the Pacific theater of the war, because they felt that war had become unthinkable and they needed to do something different in terms of the global arena to help facilitate an end of war and make war in the future less likely. And one of the reasons to do that was to be more economic interdependent. And if they were economically interdependent, countries who trade with each other, they don't need to go to war with each other. So the foundation of economic globalization, contemporary globalization, was laid at Bretton Woods in an attempt to overcome war. The IMF and World Bank have a lot in common, but there are some subtle differences. We saw yesterday that the IMF and World Bank both were designed to help nations recover from the war. World Bank specifically was there to provide loans to countries like France that were devastated at the end of the war because much of the fighting happened in France. So France needed an infusion of capital. They needed money to build bridges and schools and railway and highways and factories. And the fear was if the League of Nations, which will become the United Nations, if the other great powers of the world allowed France to simply suffer, and that's what would have done under zero-sum policies in the past, then France may have been tempted into extremism, much like Germany suffered at the end of World War I, and they slid into fascism, or much like Russia suffered at the end of World War I, and they slid into communism. So having learned the lessons of history, the Allies, some of France's great rivals in the past, like England, they knew that they had a vested interest in stabilizing France. So the idea of the IMF and World Bank is so that extremism doesn't have a chance to be sown in these war-torn countries. Once Europe was rebuilt, the IMF and World Bank found a new purpose, and the new purpose was eradicating poverty around the world, helping the restructuring and the development of third world countries, of countries that were less or least developed. And the IMF and World Bank continue to exist today. So yesterday we have like a Venn diagram on what they do. Page 228 of the textbook has a nice Venn diagram as well. And before we move on to the WTO and GATT, I need to pause and make sure that you guys get the IMF and World Bank. So take a peek at your notes and see if you have any questions about the IMF and World Bank. How will you be assessed on it? You may be assessed in multiple choice. You may have a question about their roles, or you may, as we saw yesterday, you may see a source that focuses on the anti-globalization blowback that the IMF and World Bank often receive. So yesterday we saw that the IMF and World Bank are somewhat controversial, and you may be tested on that, especially in an A1 kind of format. You may see a protest, and there may be signs demonizing the IMF and World Bank. And you need to understand that some see the World Bank as a puppet of the US and an instrument of neo-imperialism, and they see the IMF as being inhumane, and we saw that to some extent in Bolivia, as they ignore the needs of the locals, and they're serving some kind of transnational agenda. But if you have no questions on the IMF and World Bank, we're going to go to the main part of today's first lesson. It's going to be a short lesson, but the main part of today's first lesson, which is looking at the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which will eventually be called the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So in our lesson, here's our lesson from yesterday, lesson 15. It says 16 up here, so I'm guessing it's probably actually 16. But in our lesson, there's links to some information about GATT and WTO at the bottom here, and some links to those pictures of anti-WTO protesters we'll get to. One of the links is actually a website that has a nice list of things in terms of pros and cons of the WTO. So to make a long story short, what is GATT? What is the WTO? They set the rules for world trade. So the purpose of GATT, and now the purpose of the WTO, is just to set some rules, to help facilitate world trade. Let's make trade easier. Because again, if countries are less likely to go to war if they're economically interdependent, then why not encourage economic interdependence as a means to uninvent war? So the purpose of GATT and the WTO is to ease world trade, to make world trade easier. So we're going to look at some of the pros and cons here of the WTO, and then we'll look at some protests against it. So one of the pros of the WTO, is that it helps promote peace among or between nations. The WTO is tasked with the responsibility of promoting trade between nations, thereby ensuring that nations stick to the rules and regulations governing trade. So they establish rules, and in the past, if a country broke a promise, and it's 1913, then there was no international agency to hear your dispute, to act as an arbitrator. So if England and France had an issue, they would solve it with war. But now, looking at the first half of Chapter 9 and the first half of the 20th century, we can see that war is too costly. It's not a viable solution to disagreements. So we need another means, another vehicle to settle disputes. And the WTO is one of those vehicles. So you have a trade dispute. Well, the WTO is acting as an arbitrator here. They're going to listen to the dispute, but they're also setting the rules so that we can figure out, is it the United States or is it Canada that has actually violated the nature or the spirit of the contract? So the first thing that they do is they're promoting, peace by giving a means for nations to agree upon trade. So Canada and the United States have had many times when we have trade issues. Canada might have an issue with the United States because the United States is putting an illegal tariff on our softwood lumber. Due to the agreement that we've signed, which was the free trade agreement that became NAFTA, through the language of that, we were meant to have free access to their consumers. But to insulate their own softwood lumber producers from our product, they caused a tax at the border of importing our goods called a tariff. Well, that was not in the spirit of the agreement that we signed, so then Canada takes their argument to the WTO, and they say, listen, WTO, these guys are violating a trade agreement that we've signed. If the WTO didn't exist, then what would be our other option? Go burn down the White House. Handles disputes. So that kind of 1 and 2 are linked, right? How do we promote peace? Well, we handle these disputes constructively. When there's rules in place, then there's transparency and people become more prone to invest. So rules make business easier. Rules, these economic trade rules make business easier, and there's an atmosphere of trust in the system because you know what the rules are, so you invest. So we'll have global titans of industry, that know that they can build a multi-billion-dollar facility in another country, and that investment is safe. If it reduces the cost of living, the WTO is empowered to ensure that countries remain productive as far as trade is concerned. So, as the WTO is attempting to make sure that everyone is productive, it's driving down consumer costs. And it encourages choice, because what it's really doing is opening borders up to trade. What is the WTO really doing? It's globalizing, right? It's providing the arena, it's providing the rules for economic globalization. So one of the benefits is it encourages choice. Now I don't have to just buy Canadian products. Because the WTO has created, a forum for international trade, it's created the rules for international trade, Canadian consumers can consume products from outside of Canada. And when we look around the room right now, I'm not even sure if I see products from within Canada. So somebody who might look at the WTO and say, actually, there's some bad stuff happening here, might be Canadians that think that we should be buying local. Stimulates world economic growth, leads to more efficiency. There might be some things that Canada has a comparative advantage with. Maybe we should be supplying the world with those things instead of trying to make things that we don't have the comparative advantage making. So, I would never expect you to have down that whole list of 10 good things about the WTO, but I want you to generally understand what GATT and now the WTO does. So generally speaking, GATT and now the WTO, they set up the rules for trade. And the whole idea is that an interconnected, interdependent, globalized world is a world where war becomes less needed. If the United States can access Canada's oil through trade, then they don't have to invade Alberta to just take it. They can take it through trade instead. So there's that reason for the WTO. But there are some cons. As we saw yesterday with IMF and World Bank, some people see these pillars of the modern globalized economic world as undemocratic. Why are they undemocratic? Well, the United States has 330 million people. The world has, 8 billion-ish? And yet the United States has a disproportionate amount of power within these organizations. Why do they have a disproportionate amount of power? Because the United States would be one of the primary contributors to the World Bank. And Americans are the people buying bonds that supply the IMF. And American corporations and big companies have a lot of undue influence on the WTO. So many people look at the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, and they say these are all just American neo-colonial or neo-imperialist institutions. So what is imperialism? It's controlling someone else. So the argument being said is, now the United States is controlling other countries, not by garrisoning troops there, not by sending in the Marines, but sending in the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, and they can use these things to control other governments, to manipulate them, to say, hey, you want to have a favorable loan? Here's some conditions that will benefit America. Some may suggest the WTO does not ensure security. that maybe it doesn't guarantee the rights of consumers because it puts the interests of corporations ahead of consumers. A lot of the end result of WTO programs and decisions seem to end up destroying the environment. So environmentalists may see the WTO as a threat. And a recurring theme here with point number 5 is that whose interests did the WTO serve? Seems like they're serving the strong. The strong feed on the weak. How do they ensure they get to keep feeding on the weak? Well, we don't even have to occupy the weak anymore. We've distracted them with the trinkets of trade. And we've established rules through the WTO that makes it legal to funnel money from the developing world. Africa is the most resource-rich continent on the planet. And yet, it's the most impoverished. How is that possible? Well, we saw the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, but there's still a funneling of money from the developing to the developed world, and that funding has been made possible by the organization, the network created through the WTO, the Imf and World Bank. So, there's a recurring theme there, and that's why we would get sources like these ones, and protests like these ones. So the idea that, the WTO here is making an agreement, that's a great cartoon actually. The WTO is making an agreement with a head of state, and who's the casualties? These are people, and they're ignoring the people. It's like they're ants, they're insignificant. And instead of serving the people, the WTO is ignoring the people and serving the interest of oligarchs and multinationals and transnationals and corporations. Here you have another visual. This one's been on the final exam at times. So you have corporate America, and they're using the WTO so that they don't have to pay U.S. workers, but now they can, through sweatshops, in a neo-quasi way, create slaves abroad. So free trade at last, thank God Almighty we have free trade at last. That's language borrowed from a famous quote following the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the United States freeing African Americans from slavery. So the language isn't by accident. The language is there because they're showing the parallel between the freeing of slaves and freeing of corporations, that NAFTA and the WTO have freed corporations to enslave workers. And we should look at the actions of the corporation there and see how it's inhumane. So we have lots of cartoons out there that are pointing to the WTO as like a source of evil on the planet. And that's the main thing about the WTO and General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. We're going to watch a review video now on GATT and WTO. It's one of those videos where the guy's going to write stuff up. So this is going to help, bring it together, bring it to an end. And then after that, I'm going to get you to do some previewing of Chapter 10, because Chapter 10 is a chapter we're going to spend a whole lot more than one day on. So we spent a day on Chapter 9, but Chapter 10 with corporations, it's going to be a major study for us.
What is GATT? GATT was an agreement among 23 countries known as the contracting parties. Its goal...
So thank God the answer this year is never going to be 23, right? Again, minutia. I'm not going to test those little tiny trivial things. That if you tell me on an essay that there's 23 original members of GATT, I don't think that moves the bar in terms of your convincing evidence either. That's kind of trivial, how many original members there are. I want you to get more at the, how does this connect to globalization? How does it connect more to the themes of the course? So we have to filter out some of that minutia.
The goal was to reduce trade barriers and remove tariffs between countries.
That's the important part. Why do we have GATT? but we want to make sure that trade's easier. So one of the reasons why the Great Depression was so severe is that the countries responded to an economic crisis by raising tariffs. And as they raised tariffs, there was less opportunity for countries to trade with each other, further reducing the world economy. So GATT is a response to one of the causes of World War II, which was economic depression. So what caused the depression, what made the depression worse than it had to be, was economic protectionism. This idea that we must protect our domestic, our national economies by putting up tariff walls. So GATT's saying, you know what, let's get rid of that. Let's have free trade. Free trade.
Now, let's take a trip back in time to the year of 1945, shortly after the end of World War II. After World War II, many countries were in an economic crisis and turned to raising trade barriers through the roof in order to protect themselves while attempting to rebuild. GATT rose out alongside the Bretton Woods institutions, now known as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The contracting parties on GATT came together, wanting to give a boost to trade liberalization.
So that's another key word here is trade liberalization. Trade liberalization just means free trade. So what's the objective of GATT? What's the objective of IMF and World Bank? They want to see capitalism globally. They want to see capitalism globally. Why do they want to see capitalism globally? Well, the cynic in me might say, so that the oligarchs, the transnationals, the multinationals, the rich capitalists, they want to see more opportunity to exploit others. So even though they're saying we're doing this to help others, the cynic in me might say, no, this is just creating a bigger opportunity. We want to be able to access consumers and workers globally.
Correct the legacies passed on by earlier protectionist methods. 2 years later, in 1947, GATT was born. In the same year, the International Trade Organization was shut down, leaving GATT as the only multilateral institute governing trade. And for those of you who don't know what multilateral means, it's when two or more parties, or in this case countries, participate in something. Throughout GATT's life,
so we're going to use terms like multilateral or multinational, and at times we're going to say transnational. And we're going to have to make a distinction there. So multi means many. So a multinational corporation is a corporation that has business in many nations, multi-nations. Just like a tool that is multifunctional has many functions. But a transnational corporation, which is the main lesson of today, a transnational corporation is going to be a corporation that, yes, it does business in many countries, but there's also a blurring, a transcending of national boundaries. You look at a transnational corporation and you're like, well, wait a minute, what is GM? Is GM a corporation from Flint, Michigan? Is it an American corporation? But wait, they have all these factories down in Mexico, in the maquiladora sector. Is it a Mexican corporation? They have factories and they have a company called Opel in Europe. Maybe it's a European corporation. So it transcends national boundaries. And this blurring makes a lot of confusion in the global village. So we have multi meaning many, and trans, which really means across, transnational across nations, meaning we really don't know. What is Google? What kind of corporation is Google? It truly is a global corporation now, right? It's not just an American or Russian corporation. It's a global one.
it conducted 8 meetings around the world, which were called rounds. Each round was designed to negotiate different trade issues and international economic disputes. every decision had to be agreed on by a consensus. During the 60s, GATT worked on the Kennedy Round. In this round, the anti-dumping agreement was made.
So if this was a history course, you'd have to memorize the names of these rounds. The Kennedy Round. I bet you can almost figure out why it's named Kennedy Round. I bet it's named after U.S. President John F. Kennedy or his family. Again, you don't need to memorize the rounds per se, but I want you to see how, as a consequence of the rounds, we're becoming more globalized. That with each round, the ability of countries to isolate themselves, right, is being lost. The countries are becoming more connected because of these rounds. So in an essay or in an A1, you could talk about the rounds as further globalizing the planet, but I'm not going to give you a multiple choice question where the answers are the names of the different rounds and you have to figure out, okay, what round was that? That's not critical thinking, that's not analytical thinking, that's recall. And recall could be harder because you got to memorize all this stuff, but I don't want a student that moves on to being an adult that just has to memorize stuff but can't think for themselves. Purpose of social studies is to create free thinkers. So we're not asking you to memorize the rounds, we're asking you to look at what's happening in the rounds and then do some analytical thinking and say, okay, how does this globalize the world? That's a much higher mental activity than just memorizing.
This agreement prevented countries from dumping their exports into another country at a lower price. Between 1973 and 1979, the Tokyo Round involved 102 countries. This round was the first attempt at reducing trade barriers that were not in the form of tariffs.
So we've tackled tariffs. Now in the Tokyo Round, they're like, okay, what other trade barriers are there? What are other things stopping the world from globalizing? They're not using the word globalization, but that's what they're talking about. That's the agenda. What else is stopping the world from globalizing? That's on the agenda at the Tokyo Round. The previous round, the Kennedy Round, the anti-dumping round, man, that should have been confusing to you. You should have been sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute, what? So America can't dump cheap American products into other countries. So let's say they're dumping things into Canada. Why would it be unfair to Canada for America to be dumping stuff here for cheap? Well, as a Canadian consumer, I might be like, you know what, give me your cheap Coca-Cola. I love to drink discounted Coca-Cola, but what's the consequences for Canada if America dumps cheap Coca-Cola in Canada? Well, the Canadian equivalent, the Canadian corporation that's trying to compete with America, cannot compete. So the Kennedy Round, this anti-dumping round, it's acknowledging that through the trade liberalization, there's stuff that's like happening in cities sometimes, which is predator pricing. So predator pricing is when you purposely sell a product at a loss or really low prices so that you can drive competition out of the marketplace, and then you have a monopoly, and now you can charge the consumers anything you want. So the Kennedy Round was basically trying to prevent that at a global scale.
There were problems with this round, however. First of all, many issues regarding farm trade were not resolved. Secondly, many agreements were not met, as not everyone in GATT agreed. In 1993, after 7 years of negotiation, GATT finally had the Uruguay Round. Unlike the Tokyo Round, this one resulted in much more promising agreements.
So let's go back to the whole idea of agreement for a second. What did they say? What type of agreement did they have to reach?
A consensus.
A consensus. So in order to get a consensus, it's not just at the end of the meeting or the round, the United States are like, hey, we're on board, so it's going to happen. To get a consensus, you need to have all of the countries' consensus agree with the new direction. So when people say that the WTO is a puppet of the United States, my counter argument would be, but all the agreements need consensus. So How's that again that the US is forcing their agenda? When they have to have the other countries agree? So again, the confusion part of social studies is we're giving you evidence today that WTO is good and that it's bad, and some of the evidence contradicts each other. Just like a discussion on Donald Trump. Is he one of the greatest presidents ever? Or is he a megalomaniac that is suffering dementia? I would say, why can't he be both? You know, maybe he's just both.
An agreement among 117 countries to reduce trade barriers and create more world trade rules was established. 1 year later, the U.S. Congress approved the Uruguay Round, and the final act embodying the results of the Uruguay Round of multilateral trade negotiations was signed. 1 year after that, the Uruguay Round goes into effect and gives birth to, drumroll please, the World Trade Organization. The WTO is a place to negotiate other reductions of trade barriers, enforcing trade rules, and settling policy disputes. Unlike the GATT, the WTO's rules are full and permanent. In Canada, the WTO has been very influential. During the year of 2002, Canada asked the WTO to rule on the disagreement between Canada and the US on tariffs on Canadian lumber. A panel of 3 WTO officials heard the arguments of both sides and, in 2006, ruled in favor of Canada. They got rid of tariffs on Canadian.
So you're telling me this puppet of the United States just ruled in favor of Canada against the US? Some people look to conspiracies in everything. The world is not as exciting as some people dream it up to be. We're not living in the Matrix. So, the previous example I mentioned about the WTO, they just illustrated it for you. What does the WTO do? They listen to trade disputes so that we don't have to burn the White House if we have a trade dispute with the Americans, which is probably a good thing, because as confident as Canada might be, the United States wouldn't even have to send in the army to defeat us. They would just have to open the border and let the NRA take care of us.
Canadian lumber and forced the U.S. to repay 80% of the more than $5 million it had collected from Canada. GATT and the WTO have had major positive impacts on the development of the global economic community. Many benefited from the development of global trade. Consumers got things for cheaper as well as a more diverse supply of goods. Producers found new markets and employment. It promoted and secured liberalization on trade for 47 years. And trade barriers and tariffs continue to be brought down. Now, like all things that have a good side, the WTO and GATT also have negative aspects to them. The reduction of trade barriers caused some textile, steel, and footwear industries to suffer from the competition of foreign nations, thus causing many people to lose their jobs.
So what's that word from Chapter 10 that we haven't read yet, but maybe you know it already anyway? When a factory says, we're going to leave Flint, Michigan and relocate in the Maquiladora sector of Mexico. What is it called when a corporation like GM decides to move their factories to a different country? Anybody know the term? I'm feeling kicky. Got a lot of energy at 9 a.m. This is when we should have like phys ed class. That's my argument. This could be called many things. It could be called offshoring. So you're taking your business offshore. So offshore, shore is your country, so Canada. And then if you're like, hey, let's take our business offshore. So if I'm a textile company, a Canadian textile company, I'm not sure I know of too many, but let's pretend that there's a brand of jeans called McBride jeans. And I'm like, you know what, I could pay people in Winnipeg $40 an hour to make them, or I could pay people in impoverished countries 40 cents an hour to make them. Hey, guess what? We're going to move the factory. I'm going to make a lot more money. So Lululemon did that, right? Lululemon, a Canadian company, they took a lot of their production offshore. Offshore production, that's globalization. Sometimes it's beneficial to the people at Lululemon because they can increase their profit, but then the product becomes different. Even if they have, standard setters in place, they move some people over to help the factory get set up. Often the product does begin to suffer some of the reliability or the quality. So it's called offshore. You might use the term sweatshop, because if that factory that is located in another country has very exploitive practices in terms of, how much are we paying them, how many hours are we working them, in what conditions are they being worked, we might say that offshore is also creating a sweatshop. Offshore and sweatshop are examples of globalization, but they also could be seen as examples of the strong just saying, you know what, we fed on all of the weak over here in Winnipeg, now we need to find weaker people to feed on so we can pay them less per hour to make our stuff. So offshoring, sweatshops, sometimes they're called branch plants, outsourcing. Sometimes a company might outsource. So Dell Computers is an American company, and they could have an American, help desk to call when my Dell computer doesn't work. But Americans like to get paid a lot of money. So let's hire someone else that speaks American. What's the most American-speaking country in the world? And yes, I know Americans speak English, I'm not that dumb. India. India has more English speakers than anyone else. So we're going to create help centers in India where we can pay people significantly less to answer the phone, pretend that they're in Louisiana, and it'll be like, hey, this is Bob. Yeah, did you see that game last night? Wow, LSU sure had a good game against Texas, but they're actually in Delhi and they have no idea. But they have a script in front of them because they create a character at work, an Americanized character, so that American consumers can feel more comfortable with the illusion that they're getting American support. But in reality, they're getting support from India, and the person that they're talking to is getting paid an exploitive wage. Sweatshops, outsourcing, offshoring, branch plants. It's all connected to the consequences of the WTO. WTO creates a global market, but because of it, we see new opportunities to exploit.
As some countries cut costs in order to get a better price advantage, many companies start paying their workers lower wages, bad working conditions, and even child labor. In countries where the main export comes from farms, the loss of barriers has a major impact on the environment. Since trade is easier and less expensive, there is a higher demand, meaning more factories and farms, ergo, more pollution due to pesticides.
I don't use ergo enough.
How is this an example of economic globalization, you ask? Easy. Each negotiation round completed by GATT and the WTO resulted in the reduction of trade barriers or the decrease of tariffs on products. These changes allowed more trade to take place between nations, which in turn allowed for the expansion of economic relations and markets as well as free trade. Now, let's take a break from looking in the past and start looking in the present. During this year, trade is expected to be weaker due to the certain economies dealing with the debt crisis. According to the WTO, this will recover only slightly in 2014. Global trade is believed to grow 3.3% this year, which is 1.2% less than what was expected. However, this is a small improvement to last year's global trade, as economies were still trying to recover from the Japanese earthquake disaster and the nuclear crisis. Pascal Lamy, the WTO's Director General, stated, "The final trade numbers for 2012 are quite sobering, meaning exports from developed countries increased by 1%, while developing countries' exports grew 3.3%. He also stated that the rise of the debt crisis in the middle of the year proved that the decline of global trade is coming quicker than anticipated.
So if you look at the history of the world economy, at the turn of the 20th century, the world economy was about $1 trillion in wealth. Today it's close to 80 trillion in wealth. And it keeps increasing because of more opportunity to do business, globalization. So we often have this idea that growth is good, and the only way to really measure success is GDP. But as you learned last year in Social 9, there's something called quality of life. There's other indicators of success in an economy. And perhaps the idea that everything has to grow is is cancerous thinking. It's poisonous thinking. And maybe it's not the best way to organize the world economy.
Economic globalization is the increase of interdependence between national economies through trade and the expansion of markets. GATT and WTO were both created to manage trade and tariffs among the different nations of the world. They make decisions about trade barriers and whether or not to enforce tariffs on exports. The decisions made by WTO have a major impact on trade relations and the resources and markets that nations receive. Without rules against protectionism, the walls would be built up so high on every country that we would not be able to exchange goods without costs outweighing the benefits. Organizations such as the WTO ensure stable international markets and fair prices.